Hi guys, so this week I had the sections on parents as a cause or source of child's disability and the eugenics movement. The first thing I really found was in 1817 through 1820, I believe, and that was when the first school for the deaf was built. Um, it opened in Hartford, Connecticut, and its first student was Alice Cogswell. The school was the first ever recipient of state aid to education in America, and that was when the Connecticut General Assembly awarded its first annual grant to the school in 1819. Congress quickly followed and awarded the school a land grant in 1820, and this was the first instance of federal aid to elementary and secondary special education in the whole U.S., and that was in 1820. The next thing I found was in 1832, and that was when the first chartered schools for children in the U.S. was built, and that was the Perkins Institute for the Blind. After that would have been 1846, and in 1846, the Moral Treatment, Hygiene, and Education of Idiots and Other Backwards Children was written and published by Edward Seguin, and he was a student out of Italy. This was the first book published on that addressed the needs of special needs children or children with disabilities. Next was in 1871, and that was when the class regarded as troublemakers opened in New Haven, Connecticut. And this class and others that were kind of like it that were started across the country provided a lot of non-educational services to students. So it was more healthcare, social services, and mental health type services. The next thing I found was in 1876, and this was when the AAMR, or the American Association on Mental Retardation, was started. And Edward Seguin, the same guy that published the first book addressing needs of special needs students, is the one that organized this association. The organization's primary purpose was to provide education and advocacy for persons with mental retardation and related disabilities. The AAMR is the longest running and the oldest interdisciplinary professional education or professional organization. In 1880 is when we started seeing the first signs of the eugenics movement. And what the eugenics movement was is it was a movement to improve the health of Americans by, among other things, preventing people with disabilities from marrying, procreating, and during or in the eugenics movement, parents of children with disabilities were often blamed as the source and the core reason that their child was disabled, which seems absolutely heinous, but that's how it happened. Along with the eugenics movement, there was a lot of social uproar. Mendel's Law of Heredity was put out, and this held that various traits such as disabilities were passed from one generation to another within a family. Studies that argued that delinquent behaviors were strongly associated with feeble-mindedness, and often flawed genealogical investigations. For example, Goddard's 1912 study of the Kallikak family. They would trace families' history through multiple generations of individuals who were deemed as feeble-minded or mentally retarded. And in fact, they weren't feeble-minded at all. They were simply poor and uneducated. So the studies were bogus. But at that time, what was really scary was the fact that there wasn't enough resources for everyday families to make their own minds up. They didn't have the resources to learn things on their own, so they were literally at the mercy of what they were being told to do. And of course, parents wanted to do what was best for their children. So, for example, when scientists would tell them that sterilization was the best way to help prevent disabilities, people listened. And the government took advantage of all of these poor people that weren't feeble-minded at all, but were simply poor. They were at the mercy of what they were being told. They couldn't research things on their own. They didn't have access to any viable information, which shortly came to an end in the 1900s when parents actually started standing up for what they thought was right and going to court, and laws were actually getting made in the 1900s. The next thing would be in 1896. The Industrial School for Crippled and Deformed Children was established in Boston. This was the first U.S. educational institution for children with physical disabilities. So that was a big deal. In 1905, special education training was started at the New Jersey Training School for feeble-minded boys and girls. This was a big deal because nothing like this had been seen before. The tuition for a 6-week course was $25, which seems like not very much money to us now, but it was quite a bit of money back then. The next thing was in 1954. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that school segregation was unjust and that public schools should be immediately desegregated. And then shortly after that, in 1958, the U.S. government passed the National Defense Educational Act, which is NDEA, and this provided federal support for the improvement and change in public and private education levels. Following the desegregation of schools, they published, Norris Herring and Lakin Phillips published Educating Emotionally Disturbed Children, in which they described how behavioral principles can be successfully applied in home and school settings. And then in 1965, the National Commission on Architectural Barriers to the Rehabilitation of the Handicapped was set up to try to eliminate the barriers in existing buildings and propose action for things that would ensure access for people with disabilities. So this is around the time that we started seeing more like the handicap bathrooms, the wheelchair ramps at public buildings, just things to make life more accessible for anyone with a special need. In 1969, there was a really important Supreme Court case, which is Hobson versus Hansen. The Supreme Court decided that the doctrine of equal education opportunity is part of the law of due process, and denying an equal opportunity is a violation of the Constitution. So this was a huge deal because this is when inclusion started becoming a big deal, or could become a big deal. This is when it was deemed that even children with disabilities have a right to the same proper education as children without disabilities. In 1969, Congress passed the Children with Specific Learning Disabilities Act, and this provided federal funding for teacher training over how to teach children with disabilities. The 1970s were a big time for disabilities because the Public Law 91-230 provided free, appropriate public education, FAPE, both for children with disabilities and gifted individuals. The law authorized funds to be spent on students who were gifted and talented. The law would become amended in 1997 as IDEA, and that's something we deal with on a daily basis. And this was in 1997, to further strengthen academic expectations and accountability for the nation's 5.8 million children with disabilities. In the 1970s, professionals were the decision makers. Parents didn't have a say in the treatments or the therapies or the education that their children were receiving. This is known as professionally centered decision-making teams because the professionals made every decision. Professionals generally expected parents to comply passively and gratefully with decisions about the programs in which their children should participate. Parents didn't know a lot about disabilities and pretty much were once again at the mercy of what the professionals were telling them. When the students were placed into special education, the parents had no say. There wasn't it's not like it is now where you need parental consent or there are IEP meetings or anything like that. The parents were to do what they were told. Diverse backgrounds and cultures of people started to clash with the professional decisions because some of the things that these children, the programs or the things that the children were supposed to do were really starting to not kind of fit with their cultural backgrounds, which was starting to irritate parents. The next thing is in 1972, the District of Columbia's Board of Education protected the educational rights of persons with disabilities under the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. In 1973, Section 504 protected qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. Section 504 is also something that you deal with a lot in any SPED type education. The law applied to employers and organizations who received funds from any federal agency. It forbid the organizations and employees from excluding or denying people with disabilities and equal opportunity for receiving program benefits and services, and defined the rights of people with disabilities to participate in and access the benefits and services. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was also known as Public Law 94-142, which included the following provisions. It included a free and appropriate education for all children with disabilities ages 6 to 21. So it included FAPE, special education due process rights for children and families. And this is a big deal. Due process allowed families the right to disagree with the programs that their children were put into. It gave them a say, and it gave the schools a consequence. And also, they were to be educated in the least restrictive environment. In 1981, Ivor Lovaas published one of the first comprehensive manuals on how to instruct and manage children with autism using techniques from applied behavior. In 1983, Rauncher v. Walter was another Supreme Court case where the court determined that if special education services can be provided feasibly in a non-segregated school setting, then providing the same service in a segregating setting would be inappropriate. So this is when you see a lot of inclusion in the classroom, because if the child can be educated in the classroom and receive the same kind of education, there's no point in them being pulled out of the classroom. In 1986, the 1975 Education for All Handicapped Children Act is reauthorized in Public Law 99457. The new law made provisions for preschool-age children with disabilities. Services were provided for 3 to 5-year-olds who were preschool students with disabilities. Also, interdisciplinary teams for assessments were created. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is ADA, or Public Law 101-336, was constructed, which prohibited discrimination against persons with disabilities in private or public employment. The law also required equal access to public services such as transportation, accommodations, and telecommunications for persons with disabilities. The new name is now IDEA. In 1993, the Jacob Javits Act, which was a national research program that, in an effort to meet the national education goals, provided funding for research projects promoting the identification and educational needs of gifted children, particularly projects involving students with disabilities, minority students, students with limited English proficiency, LEP, and students from low socioeconomic classes. In 1997, Public Law 105-17, which was the reauthorization of IDEA, which provided for increased parental participation. It lowered the age of the transition plan to 14 and increased the required special educational reassessment dates to triennial evaluations. So they now had to get retested every 3 years. Disciplinary measures were also modified by requiring that school personnel use positive behavior supports and meet increased regulations before suspending students with behavioral related disabilities. In 2001, we saw the No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act became enacted, calling for all students to become proficient in reading and math by the year 2014. And then in 2004, we celebrated 35 years of IDEA. Today, parents have way more of a say in their child's education. They are involved in IEPs. The IEPs are set up to involve parents. The parents are encouraged to attend and put their inputs in for their child's education. Parents have more of a chance to dispute the school if they don't agree with something. Due process is put in place so their voice gets heard. Teachers are supposed to listen to parents' concerns and take them into consideration because, quite frankly, the parents know the child best. They're with that child way more than that child is at school. So it's really important that as educators, you take the parents' word into consideration before doing anything. Communication, to me, is the best asset you can give to yourself or a family of a child with a disability or your relationship with that child. Just by communicating and making sure everyone's on the same page, it can allow for a smooth educational experience for everyone. There's also laws put in place now to protect disabilities, which thank goodness, because we have come a long way since 1870 and 1817 when children were referred to as backwards and idiots. I also think that it has to be a team effort to put a child with a disability through school successfully. Everyone has to be a team. Every teacher, every doctor, every parent, every sibling has to be part of the team in making this child's life the best we possibly can.